Hold on a second, Beth. Okay.
Great.
I think you can go ahead. Hold on a second, Beth.
Oh, I heard one more. Hold on a second.
Great.
Let me know when we're ready.
Go ahead. I think.
Okay,
Go ahead.
thank you. Thank you. I want to welcome everyone tonight. Good evening to those of you who are on the East Coast, and good afternoon to those of you who are on the West Coast. I'm Beth Summers, and I'm part of a group within the Massachusetts Peace Action that's called Seeking Women's Health Justice. And that group is sponsoring a whole series of webinars, of which this is a part. Seeking Women's Health Justice examines women's health from the perspective of justice, with the awareness that peace is a fundamental aspect of health. The cost of U.S. militarism drains economic resources at the expense of health and lives. Through awareness and understanding of this culture that promotes war, we examine the intersection of peace and women's health, which is justice. And our work offers paths of action that can be taken to oppose militarism and to nurture health and enhance justice. I'll give you a quick overview of what we'll be doing tonight. Each speaker will take roughly 20 minutes for her presentation. This will be followed by questions. Audience is muted, so you can put your questions into the chat. Chat will be monitored, and we will use those questions at the later point. The presentation is being recorded and will be available not only to those who are here now, but to those who registered but may not be able to be with us tonight. It will be available within the next few days. Today's webinar is focused on something that we're calling false or pseudo or phony anti-Semitism. And this is using anti-Semitism as a smokescreen for other agendas. And we know what some of those other agendas are by the current administration. Anti-Semitism gets weaponized. It's used to polarize and divide communities, to bully universities, and to silence critics of Israel. Tonight's speakers will address this false anti-Semitism from the perspective of gender-based effects. And by increasing our understanding of false anti-Semitism, we can engage more meaningfully in acts to oppose or to resist it. I would like to introduce our two speakers for this evening. Alice Rothchild is a physician, author, and filmmaker with long-standing commitment and interest in human rights and social justice. Her medical practice centered on women's health care. She writes and lectures widely, blogs regularly, and has authored a number of books, including Broken Promises, Broken Dreams, Stories of Jewish and Palestinian Trauma and Resilience. She was named a Peace Pioneer by the American Jewish Peace Archive. She's a member of Jewish Voice for Peace Health Advisory Council and serves as a mentor liaison for We Are Not Numbers. She's on the boards of the Gaza Mental Health Foundation and Americas for Middle East Understanding. Lubna Alzaru is an educator and Fulbright scholar who grew up in Hebron, Palestine. She has a PhD in English and currently teaches in environmental studies at the University of Washington. Her research and teaching are focused on settler colonialism and environmental justice. In her work on environmental humanities, she's proudly passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Her doctoral dissertation was entitled Settler Colonialism and Infrastructure, Necropolitics and Ecology in the U.S. and Palestine. Dr. Alice, would you start us out, please? Thank you.
Certainly. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting Lubna and myself to be talking to everyone. So I'm going to just advance my slide here. So I'm going to start out with some definitions of anti-Semitism. There's a kind of classic anti-Semitism, which I'm sure you've all heard of, which is a belief system that stems from the ancient Christian belief that all Jews are to be blamed for the killing of Christ. So this kind of anti-Semitism involves hating and demeaning Jews, Jewish institutions, etc., solely because they are Jewish. This was prominent in Europe and in the United States for centuries, culminated in the Nazi Holocaust. Interestingly, it was not a problem in the Muslim world until the founding of Israel, where hatred of Jews and hatred of Zionism sometimes merged, but not always. So modern anti-Semitism is a belief that stems from the alt-right, from white supremacists, from neo-Nazis, and this is a much broader kind of bigotry. It's a hatred of Jews, women, Black and brown people, Muslims, immigrants, LGBTQI+. In other words, anyone who's not part of that vision of an Aryan nation of armed, white, Christian, heterosexual men. This is on the upswing. It's particularly prominent in the United States, Europe, and Canada. It has been responsible for some very violent episodes. And we're going to talk about this, but it's important to separate this kind of anti-Semitism from hatred of Israel. We now see the bizarre phenomenon of neo-Nazis who hate Jews, but they express admiration for the state of Israel. And they see Israel as a good place, first of all, to sequester all these undesirable Jewish people, but it's also an admirable state. It's an example of a powerful, well-armed country, grounded in ethnic purity, eager to do battle with Muslims and Iranians. Now, things got very complicated with something called the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, and I'm going to run through this because it's really important in understanding what's going on now. So the IRA definition came out in 2016. It came out of a discussion about how to define anti-Semitism. It was a working document, but it was immediately accepted by the US government and a host of states and everybody else. And one of the things that it did was it used the classic anti-Semitic things that we see, but it also, in their list of examples, 7 of the 11 of their examples were some form of criticism of Israel. So what they were assuming is that Zionism is a core identity for being Jewish, and that anti-Semitism is some kind of special case of bigotry. It's been around time immemorial. It'll never go away. It's just coming from a different place. And an example of the IRA definitions are, for instance, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that the existence of Israel is a racist state they define as inherently anti-Semitic. And the problem for me with this is that the right to self-determination is really different than the right to have a Jewish state that oppresses non-Jews. In other words, the Palestinians who were living in historic Palestine and still are. And if you look at the nation-state bill, which came out in 2018 in the Israeli parliament, this clearly states that Jews have preference over everyone else in the country. So it is a foundational kind of racist legislation. The other problem is that the Israeli government claims that it is a state of the Jewish people, and that it speaks for all of us Jews worldwide. And many Jews actually reject that statement, and the majority of Jewish people do not actually live in Israel. Israeli leaders also manipulate the language. So, for instance, Netanyahu has said that those people who oppose Jewish settlement building in the West Bank are in favor of the ethnic cleansing of Jews. The problem is that those of us who oppose these settlements are actually honoring international law in relationship to occupied territories. Now, the next try on defining anti-Semitism came with the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism in 2021. Now, they said that anti-Semitism has distinctive features, but they put it in a broader context. The fight against it is inseparable from the overall fight against all forms of racial, ethnic, cultural, religious, and gender discrimination. So this is putting it in a certain context. And they're not exceptionalizing Jews or Israel. So they're promoting context and nuance. And as some examples, they said it's not anti-Semitic to support Palestinian demands for justice according to international law. It's not anti-Semitic to criticize or oppose Zionism because it is a form of nationalism. It's not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel based on evidence-based criteria, and actually advocating for boycott, divestment, and sanction is allowed. On the other hand, it accepts the direct relationship between anti-Semitism and speech about Israel-Palestine. It has a heavy focus on Israel, which actually diminishes the Palestinian experience of settler colonialism and apartheid. The title, Jerusalem Declaration, actually implies that somehow Jerusalem is solely a Jewish space. So this was a better definition, but still problematic. Now, to give you an example of how all this works, there was a study that came out in 2023 on hate crimes in California, and they reported an anti-Jewish bias events accounted for 76% of reported religious hate crimes. And then they noted Jewish people only make up 3% of the state's population. So this kind of finding then headlines as massive amounts of anti-Semitism in California. There are some problems with this study. Religious hate crimes may not be the appropriate category of comparison. So, for instance, the federal government classifies anti-Semitic discrimination as race discrimination, even though Jews are not a race. Anti-Arab hate crimes were classified under race, ethnicity, national origin, which probably is a much better category to put anti-Semitic actions against Jews. And then they use the IRA definition, which I think muddles everything. And just to note, if this center had classified anti-Jewish hate crimes under race, ethnicity, and national origin, their numbers would have been far lower than reported for anti-Black hate crime. And in that case, the report could not have presented anti-Jewish hate crimes as it did, and it would have had to recognize that anti-Black hate crimes are actually a greater threat to Californians than anti-Jewish ones. So we see this weaponization of accusations of anti-Semitism, what Beth described as false or pseudo anti-Semitism, started in the 80s to sort of silence and demonize critical voices of Israel, was part of the growth of groups like CAMRA, Stand With Us, Canary Mission, Israel on Campus, and then the Israeli government kicked in with their Ministry of Strategic Affairs, their Ministry of Diaspora Affairs and Combating Anti-Semitism. So these groups surveil all speech and actions on Israel-Palestine, and then go after people who are critical of Israel. And the Israeli groups have created a network of domestic and international organizations just to advance the state's message and to be anti-boycott, divestment, and sanction. These groups have huge amounts of funding. An example, Israel this year put aside $145 million to weaponize social media and AI to fight Israel messaging. Now, we know that these blanket accusations by these pro-Israel advocates are intended as a political cudgel. They are weaponizing anti-Semitism to shield Israel from criticism. Now, this is dangerous. So denunciations of anti-Semitism must be critically nested within opposition to white nationalism, sexism, racism, Islamophobia, homophobia, etc. And if we do not distinguish between valid critiques of the Israeli state and anti-Semitism, then we're just allowing right-wing forces to weaponize anti-Semitism. We are suppressing free speech and open debate. And then ultimately we make the term anti-Semitism meaningless at a time when it's actually critical to identify and oppose it. And the weaponization of anti-Semitism actually intensifies discrimination and exclusion against vulnerable communities in the US, including Jews. Now, the basic problem is conflating Jews, Zionism, and Israel. So Israel is a state, and that should be distinguished from Jews, who are a people, culture, religious group, some who embrace Zionism, some who don't. And Zionism is a political ideology. And in a democratic society, we do have a right to criticize the oppressive behavior of a state, whether it's ours or Israel or any other state. Also, many who are critical of Israeli policy are Jews. So this is not a religious war. This is a struggle about human and civil rights for all, and that includes Palestinians. Now, we need to ask, are Jewish women particularly under attack? Now, the vulnerabilities for Jewish women are that they're Jewish, they're female, they have often benefited from DEI programs, but they're also often privileged by their whiteness and class. But since genuine anti-Semites hate Jews and women, it's not surprising that Jewish women would be particularly under attack. And I would say particularly queer Jewish women of color could be more threatened than everybody else. Now, this is an example of how things get crazy. Last December, there was a study that came out of Hadassah that said that 2/3 of the Jewish women surveyed were impacted by anti-Semitism in their everyday lives, in their relationships, in work. They felt isolated, afraid, threatened. Both in their communities and workplaces, and they described the atmosphere as like the 1940s. So this is very alarming. Now, we need to remember that Hadassah is the largest women's Zionist and the largest Jewish women's organization in the US, that the 1,000 people who responded to Hadassah's survey were people who are in Hadassah. Their fears included anti-Zionist protests, anti-Israel protests, anti-DEI protests, as well as attending temple. And one respondent said, quote, "My initial reaction was to be afraid and hide, but I thought about my relatives who were killed in the Holocaust, and it empowered me to become a fighter instead. I'm still afraid, but I proudly wear my Jewish star, have Israeli and American flags in front of my house, and have a blue porch light on at night to show my support of Israel." And this quote encapsulates, I think, a lot of the problem. She feels frightened and challenged. She immediately thinks about the Holocaust, where Jews often go whenever they're challenged. And then they immediately conflate being Jewish with supporting Israel. So it's all just in that one particular quote. Now, there are major problems with the Hadassah study. We know that anti-Semitism is real, it's dangerous, and deeply rooted in centuries of prejudice and violence. But the Hadassah respondents do not reflect the diversity and complexity of Jewish women in the United States. And it also conflates Zionism and Judaism. They use the IRA definition, and you will frequently hear Jews say they do not feel safe. And I would say they are often confusing actually being in danger with being uncomfortable or challenged. So this is an example of what I call Zionist fragility. And calling out Gaza genocide, student encampments, protests as inherently anti-Semitic is actually dangerous. Exceptionalizing Jewish trauma then leads to disregard for international law, proportionality in war, and it degrades the Israeli military's claim to be, quote, moral. And it also internationally will then lead to the condemnation of the Israeli state as a rogue state. And this is exactly what we saw for the 2 years of the ongoing Gaza genocide. Now, the UNESCO had a very interesting study looking at the intersection between misogyny and anti-Semitism. Also came out last year, 2-year study looking at the relationship between gender-based hatred and anti-Semitism. And not surprising, they found people who are sexist, have sexist beliefs, are more likely to be anti-Semites, and anti-Semites are more likely to be sexist. Now, they were looking at a European population, so they were looking at people who glorify Nazism, but I'm very concerned with who their experts were. They included people from B'nai B'rith, which is a Jewish communal organization that launched the Anti-Defamation League, Hillel, and an online reporting system looking at people who are challenging Israel, as well as they are a very Zionist organization. And one of their experts was the chair of the IRA committee. So you have to ask, where did the criticism of Israel fit in with the definition of anti-Semitism? Now, the UNESCO also reported a study on the online violence against women journalists. And this is actually very interesting because 88% of Jewish identifying journalists, 81% of Black identifying journalists, and 86% of Indigenous identifying journalists said that they had experienced online violence. So what that tells me is that women are very vulnerable to harassment and discrimination in public, likely much more than men, and that Jews are not particularly different than Indigenous people or Black people when they are women. So just to share a little personal vignette, I get my share of hate mail. And one of the worst things that was sent to me was someone wrote, "I hope you get raped by 10,000 Arabs, but oh no, you'd probably like it." So it's that kind of misogyny and sexism coming up to silence women, Jewish women. Now, because of all this going on, the US and Israeli forces have done a lot of efforts to control the message. It's called Israeli Hasbara, or propaganda, which started after the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. Israel had turned to controlling the message to counteract all the visuals that were horrific coming out of the Sabra and Shatila massacres. Now, I'll just tell you what the message is, because once you see it, then you know it when you see it again. It's very simple. You define aggression as self-defense. You talk about how our enemies hate us. They're fanatics. They don't care about dying. They like to die. They send their children to kill. And then Jews are innocent victims once again. Then you talk about the Holocaust a lot. And then you say you are an anti-Semite if you do not stand with us. In 1984, AIPAC, which is a Jewish lobbying group, sort of our own gun lobbying, but it's AIPAC, issued a college guide exposing rampant anti-Semitism on campus. And that launched decades of efforts in that regard. And it's culminated in Project Esther 2025, which is a project of the Trump administration to destroy Palestinian solidarity in the United States. The other thing to really watch closely is the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, introduced several years in a row in the House, and now it's been introduced in the Senate, and it directs the Department of Education to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism to investigate anti-Semitism. Now, since we're talking about bigotries, I think I need to mention this. There is an Institute for the Understanding of Anti-Palestinian Racism. If you want to see an example of that, look at what the Israeli leadership has been saying for the last 2 years. Palestinians are savage, they're hypersexualized animals, capable of horrific acts of violence, and thus they deserve slaughter. And you have to remember that these kind of tactics were common in the Jim Crow South. It's very much the descriptions of Black men who were then attacked and lynched. So it's grounded in a foundational kind of racism. And this double standard exists because of societal expectations about who are the good guys, the bronze, blonde, muscular IDF soldier, and who are the bad guys, the bearded, black-haired, keffiyeh-wearing man, and which men are inherently decent and which men are capable of egregious violent behavior. Because if all Gazans are animals, terrorists, and Jew haters, then it is much easier to hate and kill them with a clear conscience. Now, the IUAPR had some very interesting findings in a study of 1,200 respondents. They found 88% had reported experiencing or witnessing anti-Palestinian racism. And these were people who were either Palestinian, thought to be Palestinian, Muslim, Islam, or people who supported Palestinians. So you didn't have to be Palestinian to be hit with anti-Palestinian racism. And just for an example, 3/4 of over 250 students, faculty, teachers, and educational administrators reported experiencing anti-Palestinian racism. And 2/3 experienced it from faculty, teachers, or administrators. In other words, people who have power over their careers. So in conclusion, I just want to say that Zionism inherently requires harm to Palestinians. I think it is a project of Jewish self-ghettoization and has actually failed to deliver on providing a safe place for Jews. Now, the Jewish need for safety, which we deserve like all other people, really can only sustainably be built on a broad alliance with global forces that support human and civil rights for all and are united in the struggles against bigotry, racism, police brutality, colonialism, ecological disasters, as well as the growing militarism and intolerance that is endangering our entire world. And my last observation is that the price of Israel's settler colonial origins is the hostility of the people who lost their land, homes, and lives towards the people who promulgated this catastrophe. And we should remember the words of Moshe Dayan, who was one of the founding Israeli generals, quote, "Israel must be like a mad dog, too dangerous to bother." And it seems to me that the strategies of tolerance, negotiation, compromise, humility, respect for international law, and human rights were never woven into the Israeli psyche. And we are now paying the price for that. And the reality is that, for instance, if you went to a Gaza solidarity encampment on any college across the United States, these were actually very anti-racist statements. You could look around and see Jews, Palestinians, Arabs, Christians, Muslims, white people, Black people, men, women, LGBTQI folks, all standing in solidarity with each other against Israel's war on Gaza. And there have clearly been isolated cases of anti-Semitism on these campuses, but they remain few and far between. And ultimately, women, Jewish women, are more vulnerable because they are women, and women in general are more vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are now going to switch to our other speaker, Professor Lubna Alzaru.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Thank you for that talk, Alice. I learned actually quite a lot. So today I'm going to be talking specifically about anti-Semitism in the university. And I think I have to first start by saying that anything that I say today represents me and is not representative of the University of Washington. So the topics I'm going to be addressing today are anti-Semitism in the university in general, how that is kind of manifesting. I'm going to also be talking about the University of Washington's anti-Semitism task force, which is a task force like many that have been done at universities in the US recently. For example, there's ones that have happened in Harvard. I know that Columbia has had one. So the University of Washington has one too, and I'm going to go through a little bit of that. I'm also going to address the Trump administration's war on DEI and how anti-Semitism has been weaponized as part of that. And then briefly speak about the effects on women. And I think Alice did a much better job than I will. And so I'm going to be very brief on that. So I want to preface by saying that at no point in my presentation do I want anyone to understand that I am saying that anti-Semitism does not exist. Anti-Semitism does exist in and out of universities in the US, abroad, and so on. And I actually will mention an anti-Semitic incident that happened on campus at the University of Washington recently in October. So I will mention like one incident that did happen. But mainly what I am addressing in this talk is that there is a danger in conflating anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel, a lot of what Alice basically spoke to. And that also what I'll be talking about is the misuse and misappropriation of anti-Semitism and concerns about anti-Semitism, so that being misused to advance reactionary and repressive politics on campuses in the US. And so in terms of the weaponization of anti-Semitism in the university, I think a lot of us have been seeing a lot of this recently, and it has been manifesting in a lot of ways and historically has manifested in a lot of ways. And so one manifestation is Zionist students and groups weaponizing anti-Semitism to censor the speech of Palestinian and pro-Palestinian faculty, students, and groups on campus. Also using anti-Semitism to promote anti-boycott legislation. And this is something that we really were witnessing even prior to October 7th, as soon as BDS started becoming a resistance strategy and on US campuses to and students were asking their universities to divest. All of a sudden, students who were utilizing boycotts, which is it's fundamentally anti-violent, part of an anti-violent resistance movement. It was being talked about all of a sudden as anyone who supports boycott legislation is anti-Semitic. So that was a manifestation that we have been seeing for a very long time. And then more recently, the Trump administration's weaponizing of anti-Semitism in its war against DEI. And we've been seeing how that's been manifesting in Harvard and Columbia University, and asking all these universities to sign on to some kind of compact that basically would make it so that they would so that the government would control a lot of the DEI initiatives that are happening on campuses and so on, and also control curriculum on campus. And then another manifestation of this weaponization of anti-Semitism has been right-wing groups using anti-Semitism to normalize anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, carceral agendas. And we saw that with Mahmoud Khalil, and accusing him of anti-Semitism, detaining him, and then despite him having a green card and everything that has happened since then. We also see that abroad in Europe, in the Netherlands, when there was the riots between the Maccabi fans, the Israeli soccer. It's an Israeli soccer team, and like. And then protesters, I think like they had started with attacks on a taxi driver and so on, and then the riots ended up with all of these right-wing politicians in the Netherlands calling the riots as an act of anti-Semitism, and then calling for all these and saying all these anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant giving all these anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant speeches, and using that as an excuse to try to implement certain immigration laws in the Netherlands and in Europe in general. One of the manifestations of accusations of anti-Semitism on campus has been the censoring of Palestinians or pro-Palestinian speech on campus. And I just wanted to kind of go through that a little bit more than some of the other points that I had. In terms of this point, we are seeing this thing where Zionists and also Islamophobes attacking critics of Israeli policies and practices by conflating anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. And then anti-Semitism is used to silence and discredit faculty and students with varying degrees of success. And so one way they have done that is through Canary Mission. And I know that Alice just addressed this a little bit, but Canary Mission is a doxing site. And there is a right-wing version of it, by the way. It's called Professor Watch List. The Canary Mission specifically looks at any faculty who has said anything to criticize Israel, and it puts their name on the site. And recently, for example, they have been going through petitions, like ceasefire petitions that faculty have been signing on to. Faculty who are not also like, in some ways, like some of the faculty who have been signing on to these are not really part of a Palestinian movement. They're not explicitly and sometimes like anti-Zionist. Some of them are not even that political. And then they find themselves on the Canary Mission site being listed as anti-Semitic, right? And these sites have been used, we know, by immigration officials to pull residency statuses from people, detain people, deny them visas, and so on. So this has like really huge repercussions. We also have faculty who have been silenced or gone after. An example of this, like prior to October 7th, is Steven Soleta. I know Norman Finkelstein had an issue with that. They tried going after like Edward Said and so on, pretty unsuccessfully. They also tried going after Rabab Abdelhadi, who is a professor in San Francisco. It went all the way to suing her and the university, and that failed too. We also have seen one of the faculty at the University of Washington, Leora Halpern, and I will talk about this a little bit more, who also had an endowment taken away from her because of a course that she's teaching, and so on. And then other than faculty, we see this with students, and so we've seen that recently with Mahmoud Khalil and others. We also have Palestinian groups on campuses, like Students for Justice in Palestine, being suspended at various campuses. And then also curriculum on campuses being scrutinized over anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli bias. And this manifests like sometimes from K-12. In like public education in states like in Florida, but also like politicians and governmental officials asking the universities to scrutinize the curriculum that is being taught in specific courses, especially Middle Eastern courses on university campuses. The case that I wanted to talk about in terms of faculty censorship and accusations of anti-Semitism, and a case at the University of Washington that happened was with the Ben Arroyo endowment. Now, the University of Washington at some point had decided to create an Israeli studies program, and the donation for this Israeli studies program came from the Ben Arroyos, which is this big, wealthy family in Seattle. I think like they're a real estate family. When the program was founded, it was chaired by a professor named Leora Halpern, who is Jewish American, and I think it was like 5 years after she was hired. At some point, there was a petition over something that was happening in Gaza, and she signed this petition, and the petition criticized Israel. And so the Ben Arroyos came after after Professor Leora Halpern, and they asked that she not express any kind of views that were not shared by the donor, which her name was Becky Ben Arroyo. And they said that our mission as a university and the university was kind of resistant to this, and they decided that they were going to meet with the donor to try and convince her to basically like not make the kind of demands that she was making, because some of them were kind of very outrageous and were problematic when you think about things like freedom of speech and academic freedom. And so the Ben Arroyos asked to amend the endowment agreement and include a prohibition that Professor Leora would, or anybody who holds the chair of the Israeli Studies program, would not make any political statements or sign agreements hostile to Israel, and it would require them to teach about Israel, but not Israel-Palestine. And Leora is a historian, and so she was teaching courses that were titled had in the title Israel-Palestine in them, or had in the description Israel and Palestine, which really rubbed this donor wrong. And so the university decided that they could not ask its professors, because of academic freedom, they could not ask the professor to change her courses or teach in a certain way, and they didn't see that the professor had done anything that would be considered misconduct, and they could not come to an agreement with the endowment the donor about this. And so they returned the $5 million endowment, which many in academia actually saw as a dangerous capitulation. Many thought that like they should not have returned the $5 million, but the university at the end decided that they did not want any trouble with the Ben Arroyos and just returned the $5 million. The other thing about in the University of Washington that I wanted to talk about was the University of Washington's Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia Task Force. Now, our previous president, Anna Marie Kause, charged two task forces to work together. This is after October 7th, and it was also once an encampment started. She charged two task forces to work together to assess the climate in the university community. And so one task force was one that was measuring anti-Semitism on campus, and the other one was looking at Islamophobia on campus. And they came out with these set of actions, including creation of a Title VI coordinator to oversee institutional compliance, and the creation of a consolidated civil rights compliance office, and establishing new policies to ensure consistent tracking and evaluation of trends identified in the university's bias reporting tools. So this is kind of like the things that they came out of after they did this task force. But I wanted to talk specifically about like concrete steps that they said they were going to take in response to the specific task force. So for the anti-Semitism task force, the concrete steps they said to address the issues in the anti-Semitism task force report, they said that they would their steps and their concrete steps were very focused on things that they called community standards or civil discourse and usage of university facilities. And they even said at some point they reiterated that the UW's freedom of expression and community standards are available on the consolidated website that was highlighted for the UW community at the start of the quarter, and that updates to the use of university facilities process are underway to ensure that time, place, and manner regulations are consistently applied, and additional commitments and examples of actions towards cultivating civil discourse and inclusive learning environments free from discriminations were noted. And so I was kind of looking at like, why is it that this was their response to this task force report, and that this is the concrete steps that they were taking? And it was very obvious to me that a lot of the complaints was about the use of university facilities during the encampment, and the use of university resources by students and faculty to promote Palestinian or what they perceive as Palestinian politics, right? So that was the main complaints of the anti-Semitism task force, and therefore the university responded this way to it. On the other hand, the Islamophobia task force, the university's response was very focused on inclusivity and creating inclusive spaces and inclusive hiring and retention. And so they even say at some point that they want to create inclusive spaces and affinity groups to support Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian identities for students, faculty, and staff, and committed to deepening UW's expertise in academic areas related to Islamophobia. And basically, it seems like in that task force and that report, there was a lot of complaints about the fact that there isn't that many Palestinian professors, there aren't that many Arab professors, there aren't that many Muslim professors, and so they really seem to focus as a response to that on inclusivity and so on. And so I thought those differences were extremely interesting. After this task force came out, there was these task force reports came out. There was a lot of criticism actually to these task forces. Several groups on campus, including a group of Jewish students, faculty, and staff at UW, criticized the task force and report. They even wrote an entire article about it that they put on the Daily, which is UW's newspaper. And they said that the report's conclusions and recommendations relied on flawed methodologies and unclear and potentially misleading definition of anti-Semitism that simplistically conflate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. They also reported that the conclusions and recommendations are not born out of survey data collected and that they rely on flawed methodology. So lots of comments about the methodology. They also had an issue with the person who headed the anti-Semitism task force, specifically because the person who headed the anti-Semitism task force is an epidemiologist. And so it's not somebody who is a historian or has expertise in anti-Semitism or Jewish studies or something along those lines. So it was a kind of a strange choice in terms of who headed the anti-Semitism task force. And they also critiqued the fact that the report makes baseless accusations of anti-Semitism against campus EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. And there was also alarm over the conclusion in the anti-Semitism task force that asked the university to invite outside oversight to UW campuses, which is what the Trump administration ultimately decided they wanted to do and has been trying to do ever since. I like some of my personal observation about this task force and some of these, the task force and some of the, anti-Semitism incidents that have happened is that the university, it seems to me, used the reports and their conclusions to crack down on campus protests by updating its use of university facilities, including criteria for who can speak on campus. Now, this was really interesting to me because prior to this task force, there actually had been a shooting on the UW campus in 2017. So before the encampment ever happened, right? In 2017, after the Trump administration had been, the first Trump administration had been elected, somebody on the university, some kind of group, kind of like Turning Point, invited a speaker called Milo Yiannopoulos, who is a right-wing speaker, and it caused protests on campus. And one of the people who was attending the protest got shot by a Trump supporter. And at no point after that did they decide to change the use of university facilities. And yet after the encampments, they decide that this needs revision, right? And that they were going to change this. So I thought that was really interesting. And even though there have been hate incidents on campus that are reported to UW police, these do not get reported. So on campuses, we have this thing called alerts, and we get communication about incidents on campuses like theft and so on. But like hate incidents on campus rarely get reported, if at all. And so students and faculty don't like know what's going on. And so an example of this is there was an Islamophobic incident in May on campus that I witnessed personally. A woman in a hijab trying to go to her next lecture was stopped by what appeared to me as a large white male, and he was blocking her and shouting at her, and I called the police, and then another person was with her and came stuck to her, and they tried to walk by. But until like this man heard the sirens, he was like, it looked like he was about to like attack her. And this is something that I have seen several times on campus, and there was no notification whatsoever about this. We have in October, a self-professed Nazi sympathizer disrupted a psychology class. And this is a very popular psychology class. It has more than 350 students. It's by a professor who's called the sex professor, honestly. So this is a class about sex and sexuality. And so he disrupted the class. He shouted slurs at people, and he performed the Nazi salute several times. And the university police didn't take, he came into the class several times, and the first time university police didn't do anything and didn't come. And it wasn't until the second time did they like finally like show up. And this happened in October of 2025. We also have incidents where students and faculty were doxxed either by right-wing people or by Zionists or so on. At some point during the Black Lives Matter movement protests, there was a lot of that going on, and the university constantly told people to go to safe campus, and it wasn't really addressed. Resources, emails about incidents such as shooting in 2017 were never actually sent. And the Islamophobia Task Force asked for the establishment of a liaison role to address bias incidents, but only the stuff that they included about inclusivity was addressed in the response. Nothing about the bias incidents was addressed. And this ultimately has one of the things that has happened since then is that the UW has been investigated by the current administration and its education department over issues of like related to anti-Semitism. And this only actually happened despite the fact that we have all these lists of issues that have happened on campus during, this is just my time at the University of Washington. But now all of a sudden you have this current administration wanting to investigate the university and address some of the things in the task force and so on. And this specifically happened after 31 student protesters occupied a engineering building that is a Boeing engineering building and destroyed equipment in it. And they suspended those 31 students, and then the Department of Education started investigating the University of Washington. So and then the Department of Education says that the basis of their complaint about anti-Semitism at the University of Washington and why they're investigating the University of Washington has been graffiti, blocked pathways in the quad, so basically the encampment, Jewish students reporting feeling unsafe, vandalism of the Boeing engineering building, and vandalism of university president's house and car. And they considered the vandalism of the Boeing engineering building and the vandalism of university president house and car as acts of anti-Semitism, even though the university president is not Jewish. I don't even know if she identifies as Zionist. So it was a very interesting kind of conflation there too. I'm gonna skip this because we are out of time. In terms of the Trump administration's weaponization of anti-Semitism, Alice has like gone over most of this, but what is really interesting about the IHRA definition and the Trump administration's adoption of the IHRA definition is that the founder of this definition, Kenneth Stern, actually has criticized the administration's usage of the definition and says its approach is making Jewish students feel less safe, not more safe, right? And so that is like an interesting thing about this current moment where the Trump administration is weaponizing anti-Semitism. I won't address much of this since Alice went over this, but in terms of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and also like I include Islamophobia in this too. Like I think like hate in general is gendered, right? So for example, to me, this always like manifests really clearly to me in religious stress. Religious stress can be an identifier and can lead to, and it doesn't lead to harassment, but it makes it so that people can identify you easier in order to harass you, right? And so like I used to wear a hijab, and I was like harassed several times as part of that. And like a lot of the hate that I would get was related to me being a Muslim, right? And so and I'm absolutely sure that like Jewish men and women who are identifiable through their dress as Jewish, just like Muslim women through the hijab can be identified as Muslim, like end up getting harassment as part of that, and that is obviously like extremely horrific. The other thing about gender is that it increases already existing vulnerability and risk. So if you're a woman and there's already like existing like gender gaps in terms of pay and employment and so on, then like anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Blackness all kind of increases that vulnerability and risk. And then obviously false accusations can also exacerbate already existing gender gaps. And so in terms of like, you know, there aren't actually that, I always think about this in terms of like, there's not actually that many Palestinian professors on campuses in universities around the US, and there's not that many Muslim professors either, and it's definitely like not as many women Muslim professors or women Palestinian professors or women Arab professors. And then as soon as you are identified as Palestinian or Muslim or Arab, all of a sudden, like you get questioned quite a bit about like your views around Israel, and like you are definitely like advised by peers and faculty and colleagues to like not say anything about Israel or teach about Palestine or Israel in order to not get censored or lose your job or not be promoted and so on. And this is a complaint that I hear a lot about. And so these false accusations can exacerbate already existing gender gaps that exist in academia. And I will end with that. I think I went over my time.
I want to thank you both. You have really provided a very full spectrum of how anti-Semitism and Islamophobia work together. And that was one of the points I'd be interested in having you elaborate on. It seems like misogynist, anti-Semite, racist, homophobic, and Islamophobic folks have figured out pretty well how to work together. And one way to counter this is by more solidarity on the parts of those of people who are opposed to those. And so I'd like you to comment on that, and if you know any groups or strategies that are being used to bring people together. Thank you. And that's a question for either or both of you.
So, that was part of the point of my talk, is that these are overlapping bigotries, and that we need to not exceptionalize Jew hatred, and we need to keep it in a context of the bigotries that are associated with Jew hatred. I think that my experience working with Jewish Voice for Peace is that there is a tremendous amount of understanding about the relationships between these bigotries, and also a tremendous effort to be inclusive. So, I went to the national member meeting this year, and we had many Jewish speakers, we had Palestinian speakers, we had Muslim speakers, we had gay speakers, we had queer speakers. They really tried to include everybody who should be part of this conversation. And you don't have to be Jewish to be in Jewish Voice for Peace. So I found that that conference very, very moving and very powerful, because it didn't exceptionalize Jews. It put us in a context with the people that we should be collaborating with, which are other people that are oppressed in this world. And we should also be aware that we have privilege as white Jews and as white straight Jews. So it's a complicated conversation, but I think Jewish Voice for Peace does a very good job in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah, there's also a number of like coalitions and so on, especially like I think like coalitions of educators who are working together to kind of combat some of this like weaponization of anti-Semitism in universities or in schools or in by like the Trump administration in the Department of Education. There is one that is called Diaspora Alliance, and it's a group of people who are Jewish and not Jewish. Some of them are Palestinian, some of them are Israelis. Like it's a very diverse group of people who have been collaborating with each other to try and like come up with like resources that can be used by educators, right? So like a definition of what is anti-Semitism and what is not anti-Semitism. And also a definition, like they also like curriculums and how to talk to people about on how to talk to students about Israel and Palestine and so on. There's also another group of people who collaborated on something similar called, and they have a website called antisemitismcurriculum.org and it's also like a coalition of people from different walks of life who are concerned about this issue.
And I would add that with thinking about K through 12, because there's a huge attack on teachers in the K through 12 world, it's not only university professors, that the group Rethinking Schools has done excellent work on that. And they have a magazine. I was just in their latest conference. It's a very excellent group in terms of this analysis and also strategies for survival. And when I wrote my 2 novels for children that are Palestine focused, I worked with Nora Lester-Murad, and we created a toolkit for teachers K through 12 who are wanting to teach about Palestine and are getting doxxed and attacked and all that stuff. And that's available on my website, alicerothschildbooks.com. You could get that toolkit if you're a K through 12 educator. And I think also the Middle East Children's Alliance has very good materials for K through 12 educators who are trying to figure out how to do this in this hostile environment that we live.
Mary Ellen, would you like to share the screen with the action that MAPA will be encouraging folks to take?
Yeah, thanks. So hi, everyone. I'm Mary Ellen Kirkulis. I work with Massachusetts Peace Action, and in the chat, and I will share my screen as, oops, hold on a second. Okay. I will share my screen with you in a moment. I put a link in the chat. That is an initiative out of a group, an alliance in Massachusetts called Together for an Inclusive Massachusetts. So basically, here in the Commonwealth, we have had a very sneaky addition to the budget. This happened in last August 2024, where there was an authorization into state law to enact a special commission on combating anti-Semitism. It's a 19-member commission, and it is tasked with making recommendations on how to prevent and respond to anti-Semitism, the kind of weaponization we've been talking about tonight. And of course, the recommendations closely mirror these policies, punishing pro-Palestinian advocacy, anti-Zionist narratives in schools, universities, the workplace, etc. And among their first target is the Massachusetts Department of Education. And what's especial is what we've been seeing tonight is this is exactly not a Massachusetts or California or any particular state strategy. It is a 50 statewide strategy that it has been obviously we're right in the thick of this fight. In response, there's been a very important alliance here in Massachusetts that was formed. It's called Together for an Inclusive Massachusetts. This is their website I'm sharing with you. And it is an alliance from representatives from Boston Workers Circle, Massachusetts Peace Action, JVP, affiliates, if not now Boston, etc. So if you could either take that action now as you're perhaps forming some questions for our speakers as well, to put them in the chat, take action at this link. And we'll also include this link for you in the follow-up email.
There will be a resource page and a link to this recording that will go out in the next few days, so that if you have other friends or colleagues who were not able to attend tonight, they will be able to have the benefit of the thought, the risk that both Dr. Alice and Professor Al-Zaroub have taken to be with us tonight. There are definite steps, there's definite solidarity, and I think that we can move forward with all of that. So I wanted to thank you again. Are we taking any more questions right now, or are we about ready to wind up?
There is one, which is a pretty inclusive question that cites, can these constructive steps that people and institutions can take respond thoughtfully, helping counter the weaponization of anti-Semitism? And that really is a lot of what you've presented tonight. And clarifying terms and principles, defending academic freedoms and free expression, encourage honest dialogue, advocate policy integrity, build coalitions for justice, and model integrity for advocacy. And I think we've certainly done that tonight, and we will follow up with resources, and I will make sure that the Massachusetts Commission has all of this webinar in the resource page. It will enlighten them, because you're covering national and international issues. In the Massachusetts TIM Coalition, we're focused extensively on curriculum in Massachusetts schools. But they will appreciate this, because you've really helped define the definition of what needs to happen. And thank you for your advocacy. Yes, please, feedback.
I just wanted to be sure that people are clear that when you're doing this advocacy, when you're promoting pro-justice ideas in this hostile climate, that you never do it alone. one of the things that we've learned that's very important is that the opposition is very well funded. It's very powerful, and it doesn't have limits in terms of how low it will go. To be doxxed or to be fired or, all that kind of stuff is just completely outrageous. So it's very important, and this is an example of what's going on in Inclusive Massachusetts, that you do it in coalition. You line your ducks up and do it with other people that are sympathetic, that understand the issues, and that you never, go to the dean by yourself to complain about something, because it's not, we have the history that that's not going to work. And so I wanted to be sure people understood that.
Excellent. Thank you. Any other thoughts or questions from our speakers?
No.
So Jeffrey has his hand up. He had the long question.
Shouldn't he
Jeff?
go in the chat or?
Well, yeah, he did the chat. I read his chat.
Okay,
So
let's
would you
look
like
at
to,
the question.
he had the long question.
So we can look at the question. Can constructive steps be taken?
It's the number one question, JB.
I think that we've really talked about a lot of these things
I
already.
think we have. Yeah, I think we really covered all of it.
There's more in there. If you look, there's a source link to in there.
Okay.
Good. So a chat GPT, and many thank yous for the speaker. People are thrilled with what the information that you shared and the commitment that you've had for many years for both of you, so for all of us actually. So I think we thank you. And Elizabeth, do you have any closing remarks?
Sure. One of the first responses that we got when we started putting this out was from one of the MAPPA members saying, "This is brilliant." And I've tried to keep that in mind with, some of the other responses that we've heard about, incoherently. But the work that you both do collectively is so critical. And I think the points that you each made about working in coalition, working in solidarity, we do need to keep in mind. And one of the biggest issues with this false anti-Semitism is dividing, and polarizing. And so, there will always be some outliers that are not going to come together. But for the vast majority of people, we focus on justice. So I want to thank you both for your work, your contribution, and your words tonight. So thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.